Hello, everyone. So let's talk about how to write your paper. And I'm going to give you some more specific writing tips, but just to start, the writing process has two main components, or you have two main tasks when you're writing. Your first task is very creative, and it's about putting your ideas in a creative way and figuring out how to say it, what to say it. It's a very it's the process of creation, right? And the other part or the other task that you have to have is an editorial task. And that's when you look at what you wrote and you're like, does this really make sense? Is this really organized in the best way possible? Is my audience going to understand what I'm trying to say? Or what is the message that I'm trying to communicate? So those two tasks are actually very different because while the creative process is about being open and releasing your ideas and putting things out there, the editorial process is very restrictive and it's about, is this correct? It's very judgmental in a way. And those two tasks are opposite to each other. So if you try to do them at the same time, that's when you end up with this writer's block, right? Where you're trying to say something, but so your creative side is trying to come out, and then your editorial side is competing and shutting it down. So my suggestion to you is to just start with your creative side. So just say, okay, I'm going to put my ideas out here, and I'm just going to write everything I'm thinking of, and then let your editorial self go through it and take it all apart. Although this doesn't mean that you should just start writing, you should do some planning beforehand before you even start writing. So we're going to talk about that. And so this idea of these two tasks, the creative and the editorial you, the more you separate them, the better it will be. Because if you just finish writing the paper and you go into editing mode right away, your editing self is not really separating from your creative self. So you're still going to be like, this is my baby that I just created, and I cannot possibly find something wrong with it. But if you let time pass in between those two tasks, you're going to be more critical when you bring your editorial self to then look at the paper critically. And so, what this means, for instance, for me, when I'm writing, I know that at least my first paragraph, sometimes even the first entire page of what I write, is going to be mostly nonsense that I'm going to have to discard. But that having something written on the paper gives me confidence that I can continue writing and makes the process a lot easier. So, just let your creative self and then know that your editorial self is going to take care of the problems later on. And the more time that happens in between those two processes, the better it will be. So let's look at some tips that will help you with this process. So the first thing is you need to have a very clear goal of what is the thing that you want to communicate before you start writing your paper. So the first thing you need to do is a lot of planning. And this happens before you start actually typing. And it's important to organize your ideas into maps or categories. And you will be doing this as you're doing the outline. The outline will help you do this idea maps where you can say, these are my three main sections, and this section is going to be about this topic, and then followed by this other section on this other topic. So that organization should happen beforehand. When you're writing, make sure that all the things that you're saying are supported by facts. So you cannot just say blank statements. They need to be based on actual facts. And what are the facts? The facts are the research studies that you're going to be citing in your references. So every statement should be followed by an in-text citation for the source where that fact came from. It is okay to speculate once in a while. I mean, you're putting together information from multiple papers, and part of what you do in a review article is once you put all that information together, you try to find trends or try to find maybe something that is going on that is not evident from the isolated studies, but that comes to mind once all those things are put together. So it's normal to speculate, but you need to make clear that what you're saying is a speculation. So you need to say it's possible. Let's say you find that these two studies show one effect and these other two studies find the opposite effect. But in your research, you find that these two studies were in their specific context, while these other two were in a different context. Like say, this we're looking at juvenile individuals, and this one was looking at adult individuals, so that you can say, well, maybe the differences in these two is because the effect might be different in juveniles than in adults. And so that that could be, it needs to be proven or it needs to be studied in, but you can say that that is your speculation. You're allowed to speculate as long as you identify it as such. Another important thing is that you stick to the point. Time and space are very constrained, and scientists and everybody in general are busy people, and we don't want to be going off of tangents. So you don't have anything on your paper that is not really necessary or not really contributing to the point. So every sentence that you have in your paper needs to be informative, and you need to make it as concise as possible. So I would rather read a short paper, but that everything there has a purpose and everything there is informative, than someone that fills pages and pages but is not really providing much information. So just like every fact needs to be cited, also every figure needs to have a caption. Those captions, even though you might be using figures from other papers, you should write your own caption. So you cannot copy the caption from another for the study and put that caption. You need to write your own caption. But since those are not your original figures, you did not create the figures, you're taking them from a different paper, then you need to say on the caption that that paper was adapted from another study and give the reference for where that figure came from. You should write the caption so that someone can look at the figure without having read your paper and completely understand what it is about, what the figure is showing. So the figures should stand on their own and not requiring the person to read the text in order to understand the figure. It should be just, with reading the caption, you should have all the information you need in order to interpret the figure. And your figures should be numbered in the order in which they're appearing in the text. Another important thing when you're writing your paper, you need to tell your readers when to look at a specific figure. And so you do that by telling them this pharmaceutical increases this, and then you have figure 1 so that people know, okay, so I should go look at figure 1 to see the data backing this statement. So how the captions are written, usually they start with the figure number, that's the first thing. Then you have a brief title that is a description of what the figure is about or the main of the figure. And the rest of the caption is just really explaining sort of what the figure is showing and what are the main points of the figure. Or if the figure has multiple elements, then there will be an explanation for each of the elements in that figure. Now you're free to modify and crop the figures that you're using. So if you're only using, let's say, part A of this figure, you don't need to show all 4 parts. You can just crop the figure so that it only shows the part that you're actually addressing. If you're not addressing something, it should not be there. And like I said, when you're writing the text, you need to tell the readers when they're actually when they should go and look at the figure. And so every time you're mentioning the fact that, or you're talking about the data represented in a particular figure, you should cite that figures in parentheses. You have then look at figures so and so that your readers know when to look at that figure. And the same thing for tables. So tables should also be referenced, and tables also need to have a caption just like the figures. And notice here an important thing when you're doing scientific citations is that you close the citation within parentheses and the period goes after the parentheses, not before. It's after the parentheses. And so just like with cite figures, we'll also need to back every statement by a reference. So you have to say where is the research paper where you got this fact from or where you're getting this idea from. So that's what you will be having in the text or the in-text citations, which usually is the author's last name. If there are multiple authors, it would be followed by this et al. Et al means, it's the Latin for abbreviation for et alia, which means and collaborators. So you have Silva et al, that means Silva and collaborators. And et al, since it's an abbreviation, is followed by a period. And then after the period, you have a comma and then the year. If you have 2 authors, then you say Francina and Soder, and then you have comma and then the year. If you have multiple citations, you separate the individual citations by a semicolon. And there is software that can help you do this, and I really encourage you to use software to format your citations instead of doing this by hand, because it can be very tedious and confusing. In English writing, anything that is in a foreign language, such as Latin, needs to be in italics. And the species names are in Latin, so they have to be in italics. And the species name is two words. The first word is the genus, and the second word is the species name. And the genus is always capitalized, and the species name is never capitalized. When you mention the species the first time, you spell out the genus and the species. But if you're bringing it up again after that, you can abbreviate the genus. So you just use the first letter of the genus followed by a dot, and then the species name. But notice that if you're doing this on Word or any word processor, they would automatically add a capital letter after a period. But in species name, the genus is the only one that is capitalized and the species is never capitalized. So there should not be a capital letter in the C for carolinensis. So this is the species name of the species, Cirrus carolinensis, and only the genus is capitalized. So it's capital S, period, and then carolinensis should be all lowercase. Make sure that when you're doing this, when you type in, that your word processor doesn't automatically add capital letters. So now let's look at the elements of the paper and how you write those elements. So when you have the introduction, especially the first paragraph and the first sentence of the introduction is the thing that you need to draw the attention from your audience. So it's the most important sentence in your paper. So this sentence has multiple purposes because it needs to grab the attention from your audience, and it also needs to be informative so that your audience knows what the paper is going to be about and what they're going to gain from reading this paper. So here are some examples of good introductory sentences, such as cell polarity plays a fundamental role in development by asymmetrically localizing determinants in a cell before division. Daughter cells can adopt different fates. Or post-transcriptional regulation based on differential RNA metabolism is an important mechanism for temporal and spatial regulation of gene expression. So this is sort of saying what is the paper going to be about and why that is important. The Golgi complex has pivotal role in the secretory pathway by acting as the central organelle through which newly synthesized proteins en route to their final destination. So notice that since we're using a word in Latin, it is in italics. And the introduction should set the scene for how your paper is a unique contribution and to which field is it being a unique contribution. So it's not that you have to go through everything that you're going to talk about, but it's just to put your study into context, into what is the field, what is known in the field, and how is this contributing to advance the field or to put information together in a new way. And so the last paragraph in the introduction should be a short summary of what is the thing that you're going to achieve. So just like we talked in the abstract, that you always have a sentence that says, in this article we're going to, the last sentence in your introduction is kind of like that purpose as well, where you say, here we're going to look at, or in this review, we found this, by comparing this and that, we found this, we conclude that this. If you have a discussion, in your case, you won't have necessarily a discussion, you will have a conclusion. Discussions are papers that are reporting data for the first time. So these are primary literature articles that will have a discussion. But you won't have a discussion per se, you will have more conclusion. So let's talk about some general styling of your paper. So make sure you're using the spelling and grammar of your Microsoft Word, and you know that as students, you're all able to download Microsoft Word from the University Technology Service. But keep in mind that spell check only highlights certain words, and some biological words have weird spelling that Microsoft Word is going to not identify correctly, so you will have to do also your own work. And there are also typos that seem like the same word, but they're different. Like I'm always typing from and form, and Microsoft doesn't catch that. Another important thing is the verb tenses. So usually people tend to write things in the past or in the present. And when you're writing about something that you did that was in the past, it's okay to write in the past, like, and we did this experiment and I performed this and we found that. But when you're reporting other things, it's better to talk in the present. So this thing is causing this is affecting that. because it sort of gives more relevance and it shows that this process is ongoing. Like if you find that something causes something, it's not that it caused it in the past, it's an effect that is still ongoing. And so using the present tense is preferable in those cases. Just make sure that you're consistent and that you're not switching back and forth in the tenses between, especially within the same paragraph. But I do encourage you to use the present tense and keep the same tense throughout your document. So in English language, sentences tend to be short. There are other languages that are used to very long sentences, but longer sentences are hard to interpret. So instead of having a very long sentence, break that up into shorter sentences. Even though that might mean a longer text, a short sentence is easier to understand and to read. So instead of choosing, let's say the option A is showing a very long sentence. Genes A, B, C, and D and their antagonists are expressed at high levels in the thymus of the wild-type embryos, but in the heterozygous mutants, they are lower, and in the null mutant, they are absent except in a small region where the latter is expressed at low levels. So multiple things going on in there in just one sentence, and it's not clear like where you're switching from one thing to the other. So instead, break it up into shorter sentences. So genes A, B, C, and D and their antagonists are expressed at high levels in the thymus of wild-type embryos. Okay, so we're talking about where the genes are expressed. Now we say transcription of all genes is lower in heterozygous mutants. Okay, so this is something that you observe. By contrast, in homozygous null mutants, no expression of any gene could be detected except in a small region in which the genes encoding the antagonist are still fully active. Okay, so that broke it up into a more digestible bites. So it used to be a tradition in science to write in passive voice, and this was back in the old days. And people still think that science is written in passive voice, but that's not the case anymore. So passive voice is again more cumbersome to understand, and it adds extra words that makes the sentence longer and not necessarily informative. So instead of saying the genes were seen to be expressed, you just say the genes were expressed, or the expression of this gene on this area. And so avoid using passive voice and go for active voice, where you say what is happening. Instead of saying the oocytes are signaling by this such a cell transcription, you say this signaling induces the oocytes to do this. So using active voice instead of passive voice. How you organize your paragraph is also very important. So each paragraph should just be about one topic. So you cannot combine multiple topics into one paragraph. If you have multiple topics, they should be separate into separate paragraphs. And avoid using the excess of words. This is something that students learn, I think, in high school, where you're just trying to write a 5-page essay, and instead of like thinking about what else to write, you just put extra words and make every sentence extra long to get to the page limit. So please don't do that. Here we want the opposite, because we want every sentence to be informative and every space to be used for critical information. So we look at the sentences here in the bottom. Scientists have found amazing and exciting new ways to follow individual tiny cells as they progress and move forward in the process of developing an embryo into a whole new body. What is that sentence really trying to say? And what that sentence is trying to say could be summarized into scientists can follow individual cells throughout embryonic development. And there you have the same information and much shorter. So we talked earlier that you can speculate, and that you need to identify when you're speculating by using words like I suggest that, or this suggests that, or from this I hypothesize, or it can be possible that. But you don't need to include may, it may be possible that, probably. Like just one is enough to say. So you don't need to add multiple words to say that you're speculating. So let's look at some sentences. So what do you think of this sentence? And by the way, these are sentences that students have submitted in this course. Many new and very innovative technology has come about that greatly enhances and widens the range of scientists' ability to monitor the whereabouts of aquatic animals. So what do you think of this sentence? And really what this sentence is trying to say is that there is technology that scientists can use to track aquatic animals. And all the other things are just additional words that don't really add any information. So technology allows scientists to monitor aquatic animals, and we go from 26 words to 7. Let's look at this other sentence. The octopus is a cephalopod mollusk of the order Octopoda. It has 2 eyes and 4 pairs of arms, unlike other cephalopods. It's bilaterally symmetric. It's an invertebrate, meaning that it has no internal or external skeleton. So what do you think of this sentence? Well, another thing you need to keep in mind when you're writing is your audience. And your audience are your fellow students in this class and myself. And all of us here, we're biologists, we've been studying biology for years. So this is something that you will have learned, most of the information here that you learned in General Biology 1 or General Biology 2. It's a waste of space and time to communicate, to use that space to communicate information that should be obvious to your audience. Your audience should know what an octopus looks like and how many eyes and legs it has. You don't really need to add that information into your paper. So if it's something that you find in your intro bio textbook, that means that you should not have that in your paper because your paper needs to go to a higher level. So all that information of intro bio, everyone in this audience should know it, and you're gonna take them deeper. So let's look at this sentence. The more we learn about anacondas, the more we find we need to conserve them. Much of the public, let alone scientists, do not understand the true nature of these anaconda species. However, we can confirm that not all anacondas are monsters like those portrayed in many popular movies. So what do you think of this sentence for a senior paper? What we see here is there aren't really any facts. The more we learn about anacondas, the more we need to conserve them. Like, yes, we need to conserve anacondas, but you need to give us better reason. You need to say their ecological role, or you need to address something more specific that would be relevant to this audience. And when you say much of the public, let alone scientists, do not understand the true nature of anaconda species, what are you really talking about? Because we know a lot about anacondas. Like, we know their evolution, we know how they catch their prey, we know how they reproduce, we know their physiology, their anatomy. So when you say we don't know much about them, like what specifically? I mean, there are lots of things that we probably don't know about them, but you need to be very specific. What is that thing that you say that we don't know yet about them? Because we do know a lot about them as well. So what is the thing that you're saying that we still need to learn? It needs to be very specific. So this broad statement that doesn't really mean much, it's just confusing. And we can confirm that not all anacondas are monsters that those portrayed in the movies. Well, that's not really something that you write for a biology paper, right? Biologists know this. We know that biological organisms are not quite as they're portrayed from the movies, and the information we have about them is direct from scientific studies. We're not getting the information from the movies. Okay, so let's look at one more sentence. Climate change is extremely pressing matter. The effect of climate change create unique and problematic challenges. So the issue with this sentence is that you don't need to convince scientists of that science is real. But instead you need to be more specific. So yes, all the things that you're saying here are true, but you need to be more specific for what is the area that you're talking about, because climate change as an issue, as a broad issue, is something that all scientists acknowledge. But you need to be more specific. In what area are you talking about, and what specifically are you addressing? So that needs to be very clear. So again, stay away from vague things and try to be specific as possible and as direct as possible. So avoid extra words and go straight to the point. So if you say climate change is affecting biodiversity at unprecedented rates, okay, that is something that gives context into what is the thing that you're talking about climate change. So that is more specific. In recent decades, reports have proven that there is an increase in women infertility rates in the United States. This troublesome trend has led to various experiments where scientists are examining the many pathways and mechanisms in the female body that must be performing optimally in order for the reproductive system to work successfully. So what do you think of this as an introductory sentence? And there are some issues with this. Number one is proven. it's not quite a word that we use very much around science. So we usually tend to prefer the word shows because you can never fully prove something in science. You can show that that is the most likely explanation, but you can disprove something, but it's very hard to prove something because there is always some alternative explanation that could be possible. And this is one of the problems that scientists have when communicating science. And people tend to assume, oh, these scientists don't know anything. And it's like, no, we're 99% certain that this is the way it happens, but to prove something, you need to be 100%, and you will never get to 100%. There's always the option or the possibility that something else might be happening that we haven't discovered yet. So we don't really use the word prove of proven something. So there are other words there that this troublesome trend, that word is not really adding any information. If it's not contributing to the information, you don't need those sentences. And the word body, I do have issues with the word body. It sounds very high school science when you're talking about, and in the body, this happens. We tend to, and you guys are now scientists, you're biologists. When we talk about organisms. So we talk about in the organism, this happens in the physiology, in this organ. Try to stay away from the word body. And I will also say that instead of saying must be performing optimally in order for the reproductive system to work successfully, there's probably a much shorter way to say that. So how would you say this in a shorter way? What would be your way to fix this introductory sentence? I will start by saying infertility rates have been increasing in the last 2 decades, or give an actual number. If you have that statistic, you should report it. What is the statistic? Or infertility rates have doubled in the last 20 years, or what is the actual number? That would be making it more informative. And when you say examining the many pathways and mechanisms, again, be more specific, like what are the pathways that are we examining? So are you looking at hormones? Are you looking at nutrition? Like what is a specific thing that you're talking about? Because this is very broad and it's not really telling me anything about what is the biology behind it. So if you say scientists are looking at the effect of endocrine disruptors in the function of in reproductive function, or scientists are looking at the effects of hormonal disorders in fertility or infertility disorder. So be more specific about what exactly are you looking at, because it could be so much, and just looking at the many pathways and many mechanisms is not really telling us anything about what this paper is about. So the goal with this is not really to scare you. I hope I didn't scare you too much, but it is to show you examples and try to tackle those common missteps that we have when you're writing, and how to distinguish that maybe some of these things were okay when you were writing in high school, but now you're college seniors and you're biologists and you're scientists, and you need to write like a scientist. And this ability of writing like a scientist will help you even if you don't pursue a career in science. So being able to back up your statements with facts is something that is going to make you credible in any field that you go into. And we are in a world today where facts are becoming politicized, and everybody says, I have my facts, you have your facts. That's not true. There are only one set of facts. We might have different ways of looking at the facts, but when we have different sets of facts, we're saying that there are different ways of reality, and that makes communication very difficult. So we need to make sure that the statements that we're saying are backed by facts, and that we're being as informative in our sentences as possible. So thank you, and I hope that was helpful.